Hi there and welcome to English Language Support as part of the Student Learning Support Service. My name is Lauren and today we're going to be talking about the active and the passive voice, particularly about the passive voice. So let's start with some quick definitions about what distinguishes the active from the passive voice. The active voice is where the subject of a sentence performs the verb's action, so performs the thing in the sentence. For example, the author argues that all dogs are good boys. Here it is the author, the subject of the sentence, who's doing the arguing, performing the action of arguing. In the passive voice, however, the subject is acted on by the verb. So the verb is doing something to the subject of the sentence. For example, it is argued by the author that all dogs are good boys. And so in this module, we're going to break down why we might use the active voice and why we might use the passive voice. Because firstly, the active voice is seen generally to be more clear, more direct, and has a stronger tone. So it's useful in these contexts where we do really want to emphasize who is doing the thing in the sentence. The passive voice is seen as being a little bit more subtle. Some say it's weaker, and the reason for this is that it can obscure information. So in this last example, I can actually remove the word author. Now we don't even know who has argued. And this can be very, very useful in certain contexts, particularly in our academic writing. Or it can make our writing seem mistrustworthy and indirect. So it really depends very much on the context of what we're writing, who we're writing for, and why we are doing it. And we construct the passive voice in a relatively simple way. We take the conjugated form of the verb to be, so words like is, was, has been, and we put them together with the verb's past participle, which is the verb with the form ed if it's a regular verb. So for example, it is argued that all dogs are good boys, or she was spoken to very firmly by her boss, or a new policy has been established. In all three of these examples, I have my conjugated form of the verb to be, is, was, and has been, and I have the past participle form of the verb, argued, spoken, and established. Two regular verbs and one irregular verb. And there are quite a number of reasons why we might use the passive voice. The first one is most often when we want to focus the reader's attention on the event or the object of the sentence rather than who actually performed that action. For example, at the time, reforms to the voting system were being brought in by the new government. In this example, the government's role is not as important as the reforms to the voting system. Perhaps I'm writing an essay about voting system reform. This is the thing that I want my reader to focus on. Or a much simpler example, the squirrel was chased by the dog. In this case, again, I'm probably writing about the squirrel rather than writing about the dog. Another very common use of the passive voice is when we actually don't know who did the action. For example, her application to become an MP has been rejected. Who was it rejected by? I probably don't know, especially if I'm on the other end of that application process. Or the store was broken into at midnight last night. In a similar vein to this, it may not necessarily be that we don't know who did the action, but we don't want to say who did the action. We don't want the reader to know who did the action, particularly with things like the example in the bottom here. You see this quite often in things like newspaper reports or politicians' statements when people want to obscure who is responsible for something. And this is one of the reasons why sometimes the passive voice can seem mistrustful. It can also be seen as very objective, but if we're using it to hide who did something, a savvy reader might pick up on that and ask us, why are we hiding who did this action? Similarly, we also use the passive voice when it's simply not worth mentioning who did the action, when it's very obvious or it's heavily implied. So the protesters were all sentenced to 6 months in prison. The verb sentenced here indicates that this is probably by a judge or a jury, somebody in that kind of authority. So I probably don't need to say, or if again taking the example from last time, the thief was arrested, the thief was probably arrested by the police. Who else is going to do that in that situation? Or perhaps I've already mentioned the person who did this in a previous sentence, and to say their name again would simply be repetition. The last common reason to use the passive voice is when we're putting forward a claim that may not necessarily be a fact or might be just a belief. So, for example, it is believed that rebel forces used the internet to plan their campaign, or the data may have been corrupted by errors in calculation. And this is a case where it's very useful when we're constructing our arguments or when we're putting forward a hypothesis or a claim, something that we maybe haven't yet proven or we're building an argument upon. So before you use the passive voice, it's important to ask yourself whether or not you need it. And its use is often discipline specific. For example, the passive voice is used far more commonly in the sciences than it is in the humanities. And this is because in the sciences, the passive voice is used to maintain a sense of objectivity. We don't necessarily need the personal details of who conducted an experiment. It's more important to focus on the results of that experiment and to maintain that tone of impartiality and keep it impersonal. Whereas in the humanities and sometimes in the social sciences, the author's own beliefs or argument or interpretation or analysis is very important. And also when we're attributing ideas, it's very important often for the reader to know who those ideas are being attributed to. So this is the first thing to think about. Is the passive voice common practice in my discipline, and is it appropriate in the type of writing that I'm doing? For example, it's far more appropriate to write in the passive voice in a lab report than it is in a piece of reflective writing. The next thing to consider is that the passive voice is often wordier and, as I said, less direct. But it can be more objective. And so does the reader need to know who did the action? Will your writing sound more overly complicated or wordy if you use the passive voice? Or will it create that sense of objectivity? Or will it create a sense of mistrust in your reader? Again, if I take that example of a lab report versus reflective writing, the passive voice in a lab report is going to maintain that tone of objectivity. Whereas the passive voice in reflective writing might create a sense that you don't want to take responsibility for the mistakes that you made or for beliefs of yours or things that might have changed in your practice. And that might create a sense of mistrust in your reader. For example, it was found that students who enrolled in the program were more likely to succeed. In this example, I don't need to say the study found, I don't need to say that I, the researcher, found. What's important here is the findings. So the passive voice is appropriate. In the example, an error was made, an attempt will be made to fix it. Here, that kind of mistrust starts to come through. As a reader, I'm left thinking, well, who made an error? Why aren't you taking responsibility? And who's going to be making this attempt to fix it? Can I trust this person who's going to fix it? In a piece of reflective writing, for example, it would probably be more appropriate to say, I made an error, I will attempt to fix it. So let's now have a look at a couple of more complicated paragraphs. Here is a paragraph written entirely in the passive voice. And I want you to pay attention to the rhythm of the sentences, the wordiness of the language, and how direct the writing seems to you. The study was conducted by the council in order to determine the best use of community construction resources. A survey was completed by residents who were given 5 construction regulation criteria to assess. It was found that contractors should be wary of who is employed to conduct building inspections, as, in the past, building inspectors have been fined for misconduct. You might have found by listening to this that it sounds very monotonous in its rhythm. It's also very wordy, and who is doing what in the sentence isn't necessarily clear. So as a reader, you might be left wondering, well, what's actually the most important information here? However, there are also parts of this where it may be more appropriate to use the passive voice. For example, the study was conducted. So this is where we need to start asking ourselves some questions. I'm going to try this now in the active voice. The council conducted a study to determine the best use of community construction resources. Residents completed a survey and assessed 5 construction regulation criteria. The study found that contractors should be wary of who they employ to conduct building inspections, as, in the past, the council has fined former building inspectors for misconduct. As you can see, this is firstly shorter than the previous example. It's also more direct. I'm not questioning who did what in the sentence. But there's some information here that maybe I don't necessarily need. Is the council really the most important part of this paragraph, or is the study the most important part, for example? Realistically, in our academic writing, we're probably going to use a mix of the active and passive voice, interchanging it amongst our sentences depending on what we're writing about, why we're writing it, whether we've already repeated information, if the subject is already clear to the reader, etc. So now let's look at a mixed paragraph. The study was conducted by the council in order to determine the best use of community construction resources. Residents completed a survey and assessed 5 construction regulation criteria. The study found that contractors should be wary of who is employed to conduct building inspections, as in the past, building inspectors have been fined for misconduct. Here, I'm trying to use the active and the passive where they're most appropriate in the sentence, depending on what information I most want to convey to my reader. So I'm focusing the study, for example, in the beginning here. But in the second part, the residents were the ones who completed that survey, and maybe their participation in this survey is actually very important. And finally, it's not necessary for me to know that it was the council who fined these contractors. I just need to know that they were fined. So remember to consider these things in your own writing. It's all very well and good to know how to construct the passive voice, but it's really important to know when it is most appropriate to use it. So ask yourself those questions that I posed to you before, and hopefully this will give you a better idea of whether or not you should use the active or the passive voice. That's all from me. I will see you next time.